In this section, I'll give you a very gentle introduction to some of the most foundational basic UiPath skills. We'll start with sequences and flowcharts so you can get a sense for how to organize the various activities your robot will perform. Then I'll show you how to use an activity to display a message box to the user. Then we'll move on to a different activity that allows us to be able to log items into the output window, which is going to be very important for keeping track of what your robot is doing and displaying a history of steps when it comes time to troubleshoot. Finally, we'll move on to an activity that allows us to open and read a text file. So let's get to it. I know you're excited to start trying some of these activities, but what I decided I want to do first is to walk through all of the activities to give you a sense of what's here. And by doing that, maybe you'll start to form some ideas about the possibilities within your organization. I'll preface this by mentioning that I've already clicked on the Manage Packages button, and I've installed all of the currently available packages. So when I expand my Available node here, you can see I have a lot of choices. I'm going to start from the bottom and look at Workflow. As I mentioned during the demo, your robots are almost always going to start with either a flowchart, which can be found in here, or a sequence, which can be found in Control Flow, right there. So right off the bat, you should get a sense for what these workflow activities are all about. Taking a closer look inside of Control Flow, you see that we have a variety of looping constructs like do while, for each. We've got conditionals like if. We have the ability to switch, and we've got delay, which means just to wait for a certain period of time. You can also use break to break out of loops. State machine is a more advanced topic, so I'll leave that for future lectures. Error handling contains things like try catch, throw and rethrow, and also terminate workflow, and I'm going to cover that in the error handling section. We've got this thing called invoke, and I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that when you hover over any of these things, it actually shows a description about what they're for. So you can see that this one will synchronously invoke VB.NET code. And if you don't know what VB.NET code is, or synchronously, be sure to check out my Tech Primer course. You can see that we can also invoke a workflow file, which is similar to making a function call in programming. I'm going to save programming for last because that's the most technical. If we jump up here to UI automation, you can see we've got things like element, text, OCR, which is optical character recognition, image, browser, and window. Jumping into browser here, you can see that we have the ability to open a browser, then attach to the browser. We can go back and go forward. We can navigate to specific URLs, refresh the browser, and we can even inject JavaScript. A window refers to desktop applications, and once an application is open, we can attach to a window, we can maximize or minimize or move, and we can restore once it's been minimized. When we're talking about elements, inside mouse here, you can see that we can click or double click or hover over elements, and that usually pertains to UI interfaces in either desktop or web applications. Inside the keyboard here, we can send a hotkey or type into or even type secure text, which will obscure the characters of a password if you're typing in a password. Inside of OCR, we've got things like screen scraping, where you can get OCR text. And when you hover over this, you see that it extracts a string from an indicated UI element using the OCR screen scraping method. Inside Engine, you can see in the future we'll have the ability to integrate with Abby or Google or Microsoft OCR engines. Moving along to user events, we've got things like key press trigger, which as you can see is going to monitor a keyboard event on a specific UI element, and it says this can only be used inside a monitor events activity. You can see that that monitor events activity is down here, and this is going to listen to multiple activities, also known as triggers, and when triggered, it executes the activities specified in the event handler container. So that simply means that you can drag this monitor events into your robot and then have it listen for various things like hotkeys or mouse key combinations and even key presses. So that will allow the robot to take a different course of action depending upon any of these triggers that might occur. Twilio is a third-party service that can make outbound phone calls and send SMS messages. You have to have a Twilio account, and it does cost money to use this, but just keep in mind that your robot is capable of sending SMS messages or outbound phone calls. A great use case in my mind for this is if the robot fails for some reason, it could actually send an SMS messages to a variety of people who are responsible for handling robot failures. Inside the Microsoft node, we've got a bunch of programmatic related things like invoking workflow, load activity, add to dictionary, clear dictionary, These are most likely all things that are related to the Windows workflow foundation upon which UiPath automations are based. As I discussed in some of the overview videos, part of the UiPath offering is this web application called Orchestrator, and along with scheduling our robots, Orchestrator is capable of storing robot assets. These can be strings or integers, or even things like credentials, which consists of a username and password. And when we drag these activities into our robot, that enables us to get the value of these assets by name and use them within our robots. Orchestrator is also capable of stopping the execution of a robot, and inside this process node, you'll see this should stop activity. And when I hover over it, it says this checks if the stop was triggered in UiPath Orchestrator. And by dragging this into your robot, if you're inside of a long-running loop, maybe you can check to see whether stop was clicked, and you can clean up gracefully and exit on your own terms. Inside of queues, you see that we can add queue items, add transactions, and get transactions. That's a more advanced topic that I'll cover in the Orchestrator sections. Under the cognitive node, some pretty cool stuff in here. Google and IBM and Microsoft offer cloud-based services that you can pay for. So for instance, Google Translate, if you drag this into your robot, you can take a chunk of text from an application or file, send it to the Google Translate cloud, and get it back in a different language. One cool use case I could imagine for that is if you create an attended robot and you have multiple human agents who speak different languages using it, if your attended robot needed to pop up dialogues along the way to guide the users what to do next, those users could have some kind of a configuration on their system that instructs which language they speak, and the robot could present your guidance dialogues in many different languages simply by sending the English version to the Google Cloud and translating it in real time. Moving along to app integration, this is a big one. You can see that we've got Excel, CSV, database, FTP, and mail. And hopefully you already have some ideas about how you could use those things. Under the Excel node, an Excel application scope is actually a container for a series of sequential steps that pertain to Microsoft Excel. Things like reading cells, reading a range of rows, reading a single row, selecting a range, setting a range color, writing cells and writing ranges. Lots of stuff you can do with Excel. Under CSV, of course, you can read and write CSV files, and you can append to the end of a CSV file. Under database, you can connect and disconnect from databases. You can execute a query or execute a non-query, which is something like an update, insert, or a delete. And you can use start transaction to process a series of queries atomically. Under FTP, you can open an FTP session, see whether directories exist, enumerate files, check whether files exist, create directories, upload files, remove directories, and of course disconnect. And if you don't know what FTP is, go ahead and check out my Tech Primer course. It's something I talk about in there. And under Mail here, we have options like SMTP, POP, Outlook, IMAP, and Exchange. Under SMTP, we can send email messages. Under POP3, we can get email messages. We can do the same thing with IMAP, which is a little more fully featured way of reading email messages. We also have the ability to interact with emails using Outlook or Exchange, and I'll get into those in the various email sections. Inside System here, we can do things with files. All the things you might expect to be in here are things like checking to see whether a path exists, reading a text file, writing a text file, deleting a file, creating a directory, appending a line to a text file. And inside this workbook node is a series of activities that deal with Excel spreadsheet type of actions, only they take place in a generic fashion that doesn't require Excel to be installed. So that's pretty cool. Clipboard is exactly what you might expect. You can get and set information to and from the clipboard by copying selected text. Under Application, this is where you can open and close applications, whether they be full-fledged desktop applications or simple utilities. You can get the processes that are currently running, so you can know whether a process is still active or not. You can kill a process. Under Environment, these are Windows-related things where you can get environment variables and passwords. And apparently you can even make the system beep if you need to. PowerShell is exactly what you might expect. You can invoke PowerShell scripts. Under Dialog, you can pop up message boxes to display a message to the user. You can allow them to select a file or select a folder. You can pop up an input dialog that allows them to type some information. And this one I haven't tried yet. I'm curious to check it out. but it displays a pop-up with a title and some text on a specific UI element. So that almost makes it sound like you could provide guidance on the screen to a human user to instruct them to interact with specific UI elements, and then have the robot take additional action once that field had some data. Credentials, of course, pertains to things like passwords for logging into things. And finally, inside of programming, you've got things like collections, which is a programmatic list of stuff in memory, strings, where you can do matching and replacing, data tables, which is basically an in-memory database table, where you can generate a database table, you can add columns, add rows, you can iterate on the rows for each row, you can get row items, remove columns, remove rows, and so on. Under debug, this pertains to things like logging, where we can comment out certain things. We can log messages to this output window down here. Under execute, we can invoke a COM method or invoke a method. And if you don't know what those things are, you can watch the Tech Primer course. And finally, under generic value, you can see that this associates a specific format to a generic value that can be used with toString and parse operations. I don't expect to use this one too much. So that was a full walkthrough through all of the possible activities that are currently available. Of course, in the future, as new activities are developed, they will be added here. But hopefully this gives you some great ideas about the different kinds of things your robot will be able to do. So without any further delay, let's start looking at a few of the more basic activities and how to use them. Let's talk about flowcharts and sequences that you're going to use to contain all the activities your robot will perform. I'll start by creating a new blank project. And the name doesn't really matter, but I'll call it flowcharts and sequences. I'll shrink down some of these windows to create a little bit of space. And UiPath itself recommends that the very top level of your robot should pretty much always start with a flowchart. Flowcharts are the way that people tend to visualize processes, so it's nice when the first screen of your robot is a flowchart that shows that process. So if you wanted to do that, you could either open up this available node here, and then make sure that you don't have any filter criteria up here at the top. I'll just delete that. And now notice I have all these nodes of my available activities. For sequences and flowcharts, you would go into the workflow node and use either control flow, sequence, or flowchart. Those are the activities you would use. However, the fastest way to get to them is to use this search filter, type in flowchart, and you can see that it automatically filters down and highlights the flowchart here. And the same goes for sequence. When you type that in, it highlights both sequence in favorites and sequence under workflow. These are both the same thing. The favorites node just gives you a few of the favorites that you use frequently. And you can right-click on any activity and add it to favorites to put it up there. So if I start with a sequence, it's just this box, and it allows me to put other activities inside here. So if I drag something in like open browser, you can see that that activity is here, and it also has a sequence inside it by default called do. And if I type in click up here, you can see that under UI automation element mouse click, I could drag this guy down right there within the context of this sequence. And any of these activities can be renamed by simply clicking in this top left portion here and renaming it to whatever you want. So all of these things can be renamed. So this process is going to start here and then go to this activity and any nested activities inside of that activity. And when this one has completely executed, it will move on to the next activity down here. So that's generally how sequences work, and you can nest sequences within sequences. And if you wanted to, you could even put a flowchart inside of any sequence node you want to. So now we have a flowchart inside of a sequence, which is nested in additional sequences. So that's what the process looks like if you use sequences. So you can see that you wind up with this vertically stacked procedural flow of sequences and potentially embedded flowcharts. So let's right-click on this to delete it and start with a flowchart instead. So since I dragged a flowchart on, I've got this start node by default. And now what I can do is do pretty much the same thing and drag activities on like open browser and maybe mouse click. So by default with a flowchart, these things are not going to run. What I need to do is either right-click on one of these things, and you can't see it, but there's an item called Set as Start Node. And when I do that, you can see that it connects my start to that first one. If I click on that and delete it, I can right-click on this one and say Set as Start Node. And notice the start links to this one and skips over this one. The other way that I can string these together, if I click on this and delete it, is I can simply hover over any node, and you can see that those 4 little portal outputs appear, and I can simply click there and drag an arrow out and let go. So now my start is going to this one. I could have done that same thing by hovering over this, clicking here, and dragging down to this input portal, and wiring them up that way. Of course, you can come out of any one of these portals that you want to, and hook things up. So generally speaking, the way you connect these things is drag and drop here, then drag and drop here, and so on. You get the idea. And of course, once you wire these things up, you'll click on them and you'll edit their various properties over here in this window. Now I can come along and I can put a sequence in down here. So my flowchart can either consist of atomic activities or these sequence containers, which will in turn contain more activities. I can drag and select these activities. I can Control X and then double click inside here in my sequence and then paste those into this sequence. So now to get back to my flowchart level, you can see I've got this breadcrumb trail. I can simply click on flowchart, and now my sequence is the only thing I see as part of my flowchart, and I can rename this as subprocess 1, right click and say Set as Start Node, and then repeat that process as necessary. And again, as I showed before, if you double click inside here, you can string together any number of activities and or sequences and or flowcharts within a sequence, or you could even put another flowchart out here in your flowchart. So now this top level flowchart contains a subprocess sequence and then moves along after that into a flowchart. And if you double click in here, you've got another start node and you can drag in more sequences or flowcharts or activities accordingly. So as you can see, this little outline panel over here gives you a nice ability to be able to navigate through those various nested activities. To get back to the root of your main.xaml file, simply click on main and zoom out a little bit, and you're back to the top level of your robot. Now, one thing that I'll mention for those of you who understand already what exception handling is, and specifically try-catch, I'll mention that even though UiPath recommends that you start with a flowchart out here on the top level, you can't apply try-catch exception handling on a top-level flowchart. Try-catch is actually an activity. If you type in try here, you can see under error handling you've got try-catch. And if you drag that on, it's an activity, and it's really an enhanced sequence. And this particular sequence here, once you're inside of it, has a block where you can try something and then catch any exceptions and act accordingly. Plus there's a finally that will always execute. And inside here, you would simply drag in sequences or flowcharts or activities, the same way we talked about before. So as you can see out here on main, there's really no way for me to wrap this entire flowchart here inside of a try-catch. So instead of starting with a flowchart as my top-level entity or activity, what I might find myself doing is first dragging on a try-catch and naming that accordingly, try the whole process, and now we've got this try block in here, and we can grab a flowchart and toss that inside and rename this to something like the process. So I found myself leaning in this direction where I can have this flowchart or sequence inside this try block, and if anything goes wrong, I can have a catch down here to gracefully handle any failures instead of letting the robot just completely crash. In future lectures, I'll talk about this try-catch process in more detail, and then you can make a determination whether you want to use a try-catch at the root of your robot or just start with a flowchart like UiPath recommends. Okay, let's create a robot that actually does something. I will choose blank to start from the beginning here. I'll call this one Show Message Box. And we've got our blank slate. I'll expand my available activities. And even though I could drill down into this, I'm simply going to search for the term message box. And you can see that lives in available system dialog message box. So while it's totally possible to drag this message box onto the workspace, that's not really the recommended way to start a robot. I'll delete that. What we should really do, as we talked about in the previous lecture, is start with either a flowchart or a try-catch or a sequence. In this case, I'll grab a flowchart. Now I'll search for message box, and I'll drag and drop that into my flowchart. I can right-click and say Set as Start Node, or hover over this and drag and drop to connect them. And you can see that right off the bat, UiPath is complaining by showing us this little guy here. It says, value for a required activity argument text was not supplied. So keep your eyes peeled for these little blue exclamation points, because they're going to let you know whether you're missing some values. So the way you resolve that is you click on the activity itself, expand the properties window, and then kind of scan through the properties to see what you might be missing. So in this case, you can see that we have the opportunity to specify what kind of buttons we want on our message box. In this case, I'll leave it as OK. And here we've got a field called content, and you can see it's asking for a string, and it says the text to be displayed in the message box. And this one is title, again a string. It says the title of the message box dialog. So I can either type in here, or if that's not enough space, I can click on these three dots, and it opens up an expression editor that I can expand out wider. And you can see it's telling me that I need to type in some text, and it must be a string. So for this to be a string, you're going to need to open up your double quotes, and UiPath automatically pops in that closing quote. So I'll type in hello from a UiPath robot. Click OK, and now that text shows up here in your content. In here, I'll demonstrate typing the title right within the properties window. So I open my double quotes, and you can see it also automatically closes them. I'll type in the word hello with an exclamation point. And if I scroll down here, it says, hey, which button did they choose? I'll get into this later with creating variables, but you would simply click in here and right-click and say create variable. And that's going to allow you to create a variable and store which button they clicked. In this case, we only have one button, but it could potentially be yes, no, cancel. And you would save that value in an output variable, and you could make a decision about what to do in your workflow based on which button they clicked. So for now, we'll just leave it with this text, and we'll go ahead and run the robot. So as a reminder, you can click up here in the top left of the activity, and you can name this whatever you want. So I'll say hello, and I don't need to put quotes around that, but I'm just doing it as a means of clarifying what this thing is going to do. If I double click inside here, you can see it's showing us a representation of the content of the dialog. And I can get back to my flowchart or main by clicking on this breadcrumb trail up here. So let's see what this does by using either this play button here at the top left, or if you have your ribbon open, you can use this, or as you can see, you can hit F5 to run the robot. And what's really cool is if this application is minimized to your taskbar, if you hover over the button on the taskbar, it'll also display a mini play button down there, so you can play the robot even when it's minimized. So here we go, let's run it. So you can see the robot simply popped up a dialog with the title of hello and content of hello from a UiPath robot. When I click the OK button, the robot will terminate, and we're back to our designer window. So it's as simple as that to create a message box to display content to your users and possibly various buttons that allow them to make a decision about what the robot should do next. In a future video, I'll talk about variables and show you how to create a variable down here for the chosen button and make a decision and follow one of two different paths. But you could experiment with this in the meantime if you want to. In this video, I'd like to talk about how to log messages into this output window down here so you can trace the steps of your robot in case troubleshooting is needed. If you're using the Orchestrator web application to control your robot, these logged messages will also accumulate within the Orchestrator log mechanism. And that logging mechanism is a component known as Elasticsearch. And while the Orchestrator allows you to view your logged items, when you get more advanced, you can use the Kibana web application to be able to search and provide insights from your various logged items. That's an advanced topic I'll cover in a separate course about AI. For now, let's just see how we can log a message into that output window. It's as simple as typing in log message up here, clicking and dragging that activity onto your workflow pane, connecting it up, and you can see it's telling us there's a value required message was not supplied. So I'm clicking on this activity, and you can see in the properties window, it's an activity of type log message, and I have the ability to specify the level of this log message. It can be a trace, which is simply a trace of the steps your robot is performing. It can be informational. It could be a warning, or an error, or something fatal. And you can see that these are represented by different icons within the log itself, and you can filter them accordingly. So I'll leave this set as informational, and I'll open my double quotes to type a string here, and I'll just type in the user clicked the OK button. And that's all you need to do for logging a message. Again, you can change the label on this activity to whatever you want. And now, when I click the play button or use the F5 keyboard shortcut, the robot displays my dialog. I click on OK, and now the robot terminates. But now when you click down here on the Output tab, as long as all of these things are toggled on, we can see that the first message is show message box execution started. So you're always going to have those first and last log items in there, and it tells you that your robot started and finished. And the reason it says show message box is because our project is called show message box. The second log item is the user clicked the OK button. And of course, that's what we typed in here in our log message activity. If you click on this to toggle timestamps, you can see more information about the timestamps of when this stuff happened. You can see here at the top that it gives you an aggregated count of how many of each items exist. And if you toggle this off, they will go away. You toggle it back on, and now you see them. If you want to clear the log, you can simply click here on the Clear All button. So that's how you log messages into this output pane down here, and those log messages are eventually going to wind up in the orchestrator logging mechanism. Let's get a little more sophisticated and learn how to open and read a text file. So again, I can jump into my activities window here, and I can type the word read text, and you see we've got under available system file, read text file. If I drag this on here, what I can do is I can pull this down, and I can grab this guy, and I can drag it on top of this, and notice that that's going to light up those connectors. And when I do that, it's going to insert this into this flow. So that's a quick and easy way to change your workflow. Now, it's telling me file name was not supplied. So I'm clicking on that activity. You can see here's our file name attribute, and it says the path of the file to be read. And when you hover over that, you can see that it's expecting a string value. So if you click on this 3 buttons here, you can supply that path, or just simply type it right here. I'll open my double quotes. I'll say C:\open me.txt. So let's go create that file. I've got my C drive open. I'll right click here. And actually when I right click on the root of C, it's not allowing me to create a new folder. So I'm going to jump into this directory here called robot files. And I'll right click in here and say new text document. I'll call it openme.txt because that's what we specified over here. But now since it's in this robot files directory, of course I'll need to modify this just like that. So inside openme, I'll type in hello from inside a file, and I'll close and save that. So in read text file, I've supplied a path to that file, and even though we haven't discussed variables yet, I'll need to talk about that right now. So make sure that you jump ahead to the variables section and learn more about this if you don't understand what I'm about to do. I'll click in here, I'm going to right click and say create variable, and I'll name this whatever I want. We'll call it file contents. And when I hit return, that variable has been stored down here in the variables section. So I click on this, and you can see that my file contents variable is a string, and the scope is this flowchart up here at the top. So what's neat is if I rename this as my process and hit return, and close and reopen variables, you can see now that the scope is my process. So when the robot reads this file, it's going to store the contents into this variable called file contents. So now down here in my log something, you may recall that we were logging the user clicked the OK button. I could entirely replace that by deleting it and starting to type FIL, and notice the IntelliSense can detect that I've already created that variable. So if I double click on that, since this variable is already a string, and you can see that when you hover over it, Now, the contents of that variable is going to be written to the log. If you want to concatenate things, the way you could do that is by keeping that initial string, using a plus operator, and now this will be concatenated with that. So of course you need to keep in mind that you need to put a space here to separate this string from that string. And in this case, I'll toss in a colon as well and click OK. So now this time, when I run the robot, it displays the dialog, and down here in the output file, you can see that my string, the user clicked the OK button, colon, hello from inside a text file. So that's how you can read a text file and interact with the contents. Hopefully you're getting a sense for how powerful UiPath is going to be because of your ability to simply drag and drop these activities onto the page and then configure them over here in the Properties section with no programming required. Pretty powerful concept. In many automation use cases, you're going to need to loop through a collection of similar items and perform similar work on each item. In this lecture, I'd like to talk about the for each loop that allows you to do exactly this. You got a preview of this in the overview section where I rapidly showed you how to build a simple robot. So let's go back and have a closer look at that looping mechanism. To do so, I will click here to create a blank process. I'll name it do repetitive work, and I'll set the description to try the for each loop. When I click on create, I am presented with the usual blank canvas. And if your ribbon is not collapsed, you can double click up here to collapse it and give yourself some more space. I'll open up my activities and either type SEQ up here to find sequence. I have that saved as a favorite, so I'll just click and drag it on. And I'll rename this the whole process, so it's clear that this is my root activity. Then I'll go into activities again and type the word each. I'll cover for each row in a future section about data tables. For now, we're interested in this for each loop right there. So I'll click and drag that on, and by default, it supplies us with a variable here that represents each instance of the item that we're looping on. This collection of items could be many different kinds of things. It could be a list of files like we saw in the overview section. It could be a simple list of integers or strings, or even a collection of custom classes. The key here is over in the Properties pane, you can use this type argument field to specify what is going to be contained inside this collection. If you leave it as object, it can handle a wide variety of different kinds of things and place each one of those things into this generic item. But then down here in the body, you would have to cast it to whatever type you want to deal with. I'm going to do a simple example with integers, so I'll select int 32, and now it's expecting that item will hold integers. To make a collection of integers, I will create a list, which is simply curly braces, and I'll click inside there and type 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 10. So now I have 10 integers in my list, and this looping mechanism is going to assign 1 to item, and we do some work. Then it will assign 2 to item, and we'll do some work, and 3 to item, and so on. I never like leaving these activities with their default description, because when you do click on it, in the Properties pane, you can see what kind of activity it is. Also, the icon gives you a good indication as well. When you hover over that, it shows you. So I might rename this to something like process all the items. And down here in the body, I don't like leaving the default name either, so I might change this to process one item. To me, that reads more clearly than just leaving things as sequence, for each, and body. My process is to try to infuse clarity so that other developers who have to maintain the process can get a sense for what's going on, even if all these things are collapsed. We can see the whole process is going to process all the items, and inside here, it's going to process one item. So I'll expand this and we'll do some work. I'll go into Activities and search for log message and drag that in here. And as we just learned, that's going to put a log item down here in the output area. In the log message, I'm simply going to open some quotes and type in processing item : space. And then I'll use my end key to jump to the end of the statement and use this plus. And notice it's offering me to use the item variable, which is this guy up here. So I can double click on that. And when I click away, notice we have an error message. That's because item is an int 32. since we specified that the type argument should be integers. That means I simply need to use our trusty .toString here to convert that integer to a string so that it can be added to this string item here. And that's that. Now I can run this robot. It's going to go away and reappear, and down here in the output, we can see that we processed item 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and so on. In a section coming up, we're going to talk about conditionals, like if and else. So of course, you would combine conditionals inside your loop to evaluate something about item and then make a decision about whether or not to do something. So if this was a list of strings, maybe you would test to see that the string contains a certain value, and if it does, you would do path A, and if it doesn't, you would do path B. So be sure to combine looping with conditionals once we get there.